Hello and welcome to a new video where we will be discussing the structure of the spinal cord. So this structure that I drew here is the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a very interesting structure. And as you can see here, it's made up of two parts. This portion on the outside and there's butterfly looking portion on the inside. The part that's on the outside or on the periphery that I'm outlining right here, this is known as the white matter. And the part on the inside is known as the gray matter of the spinal cord. So as you can see here, we have the gray matter on the inside and the white matter on the outside. And this is the opposite as we had in the brain. In the brain, we had the gray matter making the cortex, the cerebral cortex on the outside, and we had the white matter on the inside. So the spinal cord anatomy is opposite to what we had in the brain. Now, let's look at the structure in a bit more detail. First of all, we have these sections here in the white matter, which are known as columns. So the spinal cord is essentially made up of the anterior column, which is right here. It's made up of the lateral column, which is right here, and the posterior column, which is right over here. And in addition to the columns, you also have horns on the inside. So the gray matter has structures called horns, and these include the anterior horn, the lateral horn, and the posterior horn. So the anterior horn I put here in blue, the lateral horn I put here in green, and the posterior horn I put here in red. So in terms of the columns, they consist of white matter and they're responsible for the tracks of the spinal cord. So the posterior column is gonna carry sensory information. So I put an S here. The lateral column is gonna carry both sensory and motor. And the anterior column is also going to carry sensory and motor information. In fact, sometimes these are collectively called the anterolateral column because they both carry sensory and motor information. In terms of the horns, they have more exclusivity in them and they're more specific. The anterior horn is going to send output motor information to the skeletal muscles, for example. The posterior horn is going to receive sensory information. And the lateral horn is going to send autonomic information. So it's going to send signals to innervate cardiac and smooth muscle and also glands. So things that are involuntary, things that we can control, part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so that's the structure. Again, columns, also known as funiculi, by the way, they carry, they form the tracks of the spinal cord. The anterolateral carry sensory motor, and the posterior are purely sensory. And then in terms of the horns, the posterior horn is sensory, the anterior horn is motor, and the lateral horn carries autonomic information. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about the blood supply to the spinal cord. So, the spinal cord receives blood supply from spinal arteries. So there are two types. There is the anterior spinal artery and there are two posterior spinal arteries. So there's only one anterior and two posterior. the anterior spinal artery is going to supply the anterior lateral columns that we talked about, whereas the posterior is only going to go for the posterior column. So you can see this one anterior spinal artery supplies more of the spinal cord than the posterior ones. So an injury to the anterior spinal artery is more severe. It's going to affect the organism in a greater way than an injury to the posterior spinal artery would. And there you have it. That's the anatomy of the spinal cord. You have gray matter on the inside and white matter on the outside.